shit! Whew. That was intense. YouTube video coming up. Hey, good morning guys, I'm the Tech Prepper. Hope you're all doing well. This is not the video that I intended to make, but since I had one heck of an experience, as you can tell by the intro, I thought it'd be worth talking about. Now, if you're an amateur radio operator, don't tune away just yet, because there was in fact some life-saving communications gear that we used in order to facilitate that rescue that you saw. Stay tuned. Okay guys, I'm trying to figure out how to best structure this video. It's going to be a little bit different than my typical format, but I do want to cover the objective, the plan, the team, and the gear, and sprinkle in elements of an after-action report because there were plenty of lessons learned. So if you want to jump straight to the story around the evac, I'll put timestamps in the description down below. So let's talk about what the objective was. Well, my uncle passed earlier in the year, and he was an avid backpacker. And in 1989, I was about 8 years old and my cousin was 10. And he took myself and my cousin along with his father to Lone Pine, California. And we attempted to climb the highest peak in the contiguous United States. That's Mount Whitney at an elevation of 14,505 feet. And I was unable to summit. I only made it to about 12,000 feet. My cousin and his father actually made it to the top. And my uncle told me that when he passed, it was his wish for my cousin and I to go back up there and honor his memory and summit that peak together. So we went ahead and did that. That was the objective for this exercise. In terms of the team, we had a couple of other cousins join us. We had a four-man team. So it was myself, my cousin Anthony, my cousin Eric, and my cousin David. So a trip like this requires quite a bit of planning, and we went ahead and leaned on the most senior person in our group. That was my cousin David. He happened to be the gentleman who was airlifted, as you saw earlier in the video. And he provided us quite a bit in the way of the gear that we would need for this trip. He gave us a great Excel spreadsheet to consult. Now, myself and my other cousins are from Arizona and Texas, so we typically deal with much higher temperatures and not a whole lot in the way of elevation. My peaks are typically around 4,000 feet, and we were dealing with 14,505 feet. So almost 10,000 feet of difference. So we started with his list, and then I reached out to my friend Robert over at curated.com. Thanks a lot, Robert. And Robert has helped me in the past make certain gear selections based on my budget and requirements. Now, since I don't plan on doing a whole lot of cold weather training, I wanted to make investments in areas that I could benefit from out here in the Sonoran Desert, but while still being safe out there. So there were some pieces of gear that I did need to invest in, and they were the bare canisters, since they are required, but I went with the small one that only would take me through about 3 days of storage needs, and it worked out pretty well. The next one was microspikes. I was not planning on needing full crampons, so the microspikes actually turned out to be a solid investment and something that we did use on this trip for safety. And then the other areas were mostly clothes and layer systems. I did make quite a few investments in merino wool from Smart Wool, and went from full-on merino wool underwear, long johns, t-shirts, long sleeve shirt, quarter zip, and then also invested in some rain pants and a rain jacket. All of those gear picks were perfect. I already had an existing sleep system, which was a quilt, and Robert basically suggested that since the temperature forecast was about 7 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit, that I actually also invest in a sleeping bag liner, and boy did that help. I can't tell you how toasty I was with the sleeping bag liner. He also helped me out get a pair of gloves, and I went ahead and ran the liners with a pair of mittens. In fact, the mittens I never used. That was the only unused piece of gear that I bought but didn't technically need, but had it with me on the trip anyhow. So gear was great. There's only one piece of gear that I really wish I had gone with, and I didn't know until I saw what my other cousins had. So both David and Eric were running a very nice single person bivvy, and it came down to a footprint about this size, weighed next to nothing, and offered just enough protection for the elements. I was running a 2-person ultralight tent, which was about 4 times the size and came in at a couple pounds. We'll get into pack weight a little bit later. So that's where we were on the gear front. In terms of the logistics, we did need to get permits, and David helped us basically enter the lottery. I believe it was beginning of May. We never needed permits back in the 80s, but apparently that's a thing. And then we opted to take the trip slow, and we opted for 2 nights and 3 days. So we were able to secure permits for mid-October, which was not our pick given the projected weather forecast, which was single digits. In fact, the weather was quite a bit nicer. It was closer to the high 20s in the evenings and through the night, and went up into the 50s throughout the day. Probably even low 60s if I would have to take a guess. So between the gear and the permits, we were pretty much set and had a schedule to hit this past week. Okay, so with all of the timelines established based on our permits, about a week before I went ahead and established and wrote down a Mount Whitney logistics document. It included contact information for everybody in the group, along with the phone numbers of their spouses, and a detailed itinerary of every place we were going to go over the course of this trip. I even included at the end a small communications plan, which covered everything from cell phones to ham radio to MERS radios, all the way down to the Garmin InReach, which was really the thing that saved a life in this overall activity that we were engaged in. So logistics plan, I'll put it up on the screen, but basically it's something I like to do so everybody's on the same page of where everybody is supposed to be and when they're supposed to be there. So this itinerary was actually very difficult in terms of squeezing in everything we wanted to, but we figured since we were all taking off 5 days, we might as well get as much done. And my cousin Anthony came up from Tucson Friday evening around 8 p.m. and we went ahead and jumped in the Jeep around 2:30 in the morning. And the goal was to hit another peak as a quick training exercise before Mount Whitney to make sure all of our gear was in order. So we drove about 7 hours from here in Arizona to Upland, California, and we bagged Mount San Antonio, which was one of my uncle's favorite peaks. It was one of his monthly training peaks. So we went up with all the gear we had, made some adjustments, had a little ceremony for him at 10,000 feet and change, and came back down. And the big takeaway there was I was carrying way too much weight and would not be able to do Mount Whitney. Now, my pack already has a base weight of 6 pounds, but is a piece of integral gear that I absolutely trust. With that said, I dropped a ton of weight, probably more than 10 pounds worth of gear coming out of that first mountain. The biggest piece of gear that I dropped was my chest rig, and that's mostly because it had about 8 pounds worth of stuff on it. And I'm very grateful that I had that peak beforehand to kind of learn that, hey, I don't want to have an extra 8 pounds. After we bagged Baldy, we stayed in a hotel, and then the following morning we drove about another 5 hours to the Sierras, and we camped over in Whitney Portal Campground. And that was about a half mile from the trailhead for the following day. And then the other 2 members, the cousins from the group, joined us, and we did some quick car camping, had a nice meal, made sure our gear was in order, and basically just had a good night's sleep in preparation for our next day of hiking. All right, so the next morning we packed up our gear, put them in our respective vehicles, put all the food and scented items in the bear lockers that were at the campsite, and we trekked up about a half mile to the trailhead. And a few things struck me. Number one, there were these things called wag bags, and it is a requirement now that you have to take a dump in these bags and pack it out with you. Yeah, not lying. You have to take a dump in these bags and pack it out with you. I did not experience this. I just refused to go for 3 days. Can't say the same about the other members in my group, but I kept my wag bag as a souvenir nonetheless. Now, they also had at the trailhead a scale to weigh your pack, and I knew that my pack was going to be a bit heavier than everybody else in the group. So obviously David being the most experienced, his pack was fairly light at about 31 pounds. Anthony and Eric, theirs were 34 to 35, and mine came in at 39 pounds. The scale was off by 2 pounds, so we just did the math, but that was kind of how we started the trip. Couple things that I did to cut weight that I'm not terribly proud of in hindsight. I brought MERS radios for everybody in the group so that we could have intra-group communication. This stayed behind in the Jeep. I wish we had it because they would have come in very valuable for communication as we were supporting the evacuation, at least intra-group communication. The other thing that I brought with me was a smaller version of the contingency medical medicine kit that I talked about a few videos back. And I figured, you know what, I really only need ibuprofen, Tylenol, and maybe Benadryl. And I dropped all the antibiotics. There was one medicine in that kit called Zofran that is really good for nausea and vomiting. And I cut that piece of equipment, and that would have been absolutely a game changer to manage one of David's symptoms. So my apologies for dropping that. In the future, I've learned that Zofran will now be one of those critical drugs that I bring with me on this trip. All right, so after weighing our gear, getting our wag bags, taking some pictures, David also said, hey guys, my insulin pump is not working and I don't have a working glucometer, so I can't measure my blood sugars. That should have been a warning sign to us, but he indicated that everything would be fine, that he had a med kit and he could give himself insulin if he felt a crash. So we didn't really think anything of it. We decided to go hit the trail. We had 6 miles to cover and we had 2 camps to hit. The first camp was Outpost at an elevation of 10,000 feet. So we had a nice lunch there. Nobody had any issues. We had a blast. After lunch, we hiked the remaining way and actually got to our base camp, and the base camp was trail camp at an elevation of 12,000 feet. We set up our camp, our shelters, had a nice meal, and everybody got in their sacks early, and we literally were in our respective tents or bivvies for almost 11 hours. All right, so after a good night's sleep, it's now officially Tuesday, October 18th, and it was the day that we had to summit Mount Whitney. Now, to make things simple, we had a quick breakfast and started to pack up our gear, but we did leave our sleep system, our shelter system, our bear canister, and all of the heavy gear that we did not need to climb the summit. And this is a very common technique. None of us opted for day packs, so we were wearing our full packs, but they were very lightweight since we didn't have all of that support gear for staying overnight. So the gear that we did bring included enough water. We each had a 5-liter capacity for water. We brought our micro spikes, our trekking poles, and then enough layers and rain gear just in case the elements turned on us. So after kind of moving down out of trail camp, we stopped at the last lake there and decided to filter enough water for the day. I think everybody filtered 5 liters of water. Now, David and myself did have a couple problems. We were both carrying the Sawyer mini filter, and we believe it froze, and we were unable to get water filtered correctly through the system. Fortunately, my uncle always believed in iodine tablets, so I always carried a little jar of iodine tablets. So I treated all 5 liters of my water with iodine. It does leave a little bit of taste and leaves a color behind, but it will kill everything after sitting for about 30 minutes or so. That's not piss, iodine water. So I did that for myself, and I believe a couple of the other guys took advantage of the iodine tablets as well. So at this point, our packs were fairly light. We had all of our water filtered, and it was time to hit 97 switchbacks. Well, about a mile into it, one of our cousins, Eric, said, guys, my heart rate is higher than I'd like it to be. Are you okay with me turning around? I don't think I'm going to be able to make it even at a slow pace. And I am 100% thankful for you, Eric, for making that decision. Thank you so much for recognizing your capabilities and your body. So Eric went ahead, he turned around, he went back to our base camp. And before we left, I said, hey, Eric, would you mind setting up our tents and our gear if you make it back and have plenty of time? And he said, absolutely. So now it was just the 3 of us. It was myself, David, and my other cousin, Anthony. and we went ahead and did the 97 switchbacks. Now, by the time we got to the top of 97 switchbacks, David was starting to have signs of, he was fully coherent, fully cognizant. We were able to have full-on conversations, but he was starting to vomit and was unable to keep down any food or water. This is where the Zofran probably would have come into play very early on. So we rested, and we said, do you want to turn around? He says, no, I just need time to be able to do this. Let's just take it slowly. So we rested for a bit. After hitting 97 switchbacks, we made it about another mile, and we were about a mile short of the summit. And again, David started to have excessive vomiting and probably dumped almost 2 liters in vomit at this point. And at that point, we said, David, we think you just need to stay here. We know how much you want to make it to the summit, but we'll be back in 3 hours tops, and then we'll all go back together. So that was the plan. So myself and Anthony continued the last mile to the summit. It actually was fairly difficult. I didn't think I could personally do it, but Anthony said, you know what, we'll just go at your pace, take it slowly. And we ended up summiting Whitney, and I was happy because it was something I did not think I can do since I failed in 1989. So now, as a 41-year-old man, I thought, you know, we finally did it. We did it for my uncle. We had our little ceremony. At this point, I thought, you know what? Let's go ahead and play some radio. And the plan was to do some APRS, play with email too, but I recognized that we had David behind us. So I put everything away and just said, you know what? We're not going to do the mission objective for the YouTube channel and try to do a no random contact with sending email. So as we were coming off the mountain, we see David, and he did not look good. So there was a bit of, we looked at each other saying, what the heck just happened? We asked him to wait. So he had missed the ceremony. We sat down with him, and he said, guys, you know, glad I made it, not feeling so good. So we put our emotions aside, not to get upset. We said, all right, let's just wait a little bit. We'll take it back super slowly. So we got off the mountain very slowly. We stopped a lot. And by this point, the sun was starting to come down, and we knew that there was no way we were going to make it back the next 4.5 miles before it got dark. It just was not going to happen. So we stopped quite a bit, finally got back to 97 switchbacks. There was more vomiting along the way. He was unable to keep anything down. And I posed the question, guys, should we stay at the top here, bivvy for the night? We'll put David in my heavy mail trash bag, keep him warm, and then we'll call for help in the morning or make a decision if he was able to go down. So there was a bit of pushback there, and he says, no, I can make it down. So at this point, we saw that the sun was setting, and I said, guys, I think we need to layer up properly right now, take our time, no mistakes, and let's put on our crampons because we did, or not crampons, our micro spikes, because we did hit quite a bit of ice coming up. So got a little bit of pushback, but finally everybody put on their micro spikes. We helped David get his on, and we started to trek down. Now the sunset had officially come down. It was time for the headlamps. We had quite a bit of ice, so we took it very slowly with the trekking poles. And David started to slow down more and more and more. We were taking more frequent breaks, but trying to keep spirits up, we actually started counting all the switchbacks all the way down. But we reached a point where he couldn't carry his pack anymore, so I clipped his pack onto mine, and then my cousin Tony basically assisted him down the mountain by carrying the weight from the small of his back through the belt, and we were able to make it off of the switchbacks in full darkness. Now my headlamp went out by that point, so I'm thankful that I had a second set of batteries. We took a moment to get my headlamp going, and then I believe we had probably about another mile until base camp. And the trail was kind of rough for us to find, but we found it. Ultimately, we ended up making it back to base camp, I think around 10:30 p.m. David was in not very good condition, but the thought there was he just needed a good night's sleep. He would stop vomiting. He would be able to rehydrate. But basically at this point, it was clear that he was having some type of either a high or a low in terms of his sugar levels. He didn't think it was a low, he thought it was a high, but we had no way of reading that. So when we get back to base camp, my cousin Eric thankfully had set up everybody's camp, so we didn't have to worry about that. We put David in one tent, made sure he was warm and comfortable, gave him a wag bag just in case he had to throw up. He was still coherent at this time. And then Eric helped us boil water. We all helped each other make a dinner. And then we all got back into our sleeping bags and tents and decided to make a decision the following morning. All right, so the following morning, we recognized that David was not doing well, and there was no way in hell he was going to be able to do 6 miles out, even with us carrying his gear back down. So he was shaking, he was exhibiting Kuzmal breathing, very rapid breathing. He was pissing 12 times a night and also vomiting quite a bit. So we knew there was a problem. And the first priority was to make sure that we could get him off the mountain. So we tried two things. First thing that we tried was to make sure that we could actually figure out where his blood sugar level was. So we had Eric and anybody who saw a hiker come by ask everybody if they had a glucometer. Almost everybody said no. There was one hiker that happened to be a nurse anesthetist or whatever. He's the guy that supports the anesthesiologist. He went ahead and asked if it was okay if he go ahead and take a look at David, asked him a bunch of questions, and he came to the same conclusions as my cousin Anthony, who was a former EMT and also a current nurse, and the suspicion there was that he was hyperglycemic. Thankfully, since he had Zofran and asked if it was okay if he gave David the Zofran to help manage his vomiting. He did. And at that point, we all made the decision that, yeah, David was not going to get off the mountain and that we need to call for an evac. Now, we had two pieces of gear that we decided to tag team. I actually thought that amateur radio would save the day, but David thankfully had a Garmin InReach Mini. The previous day, I failed to mention, while we were on 97 switchbacks, we stopped and asked because we thought that we might need to use this device. So we said, David, how does this work? How do we use it with your phone? Is your phone unlocked? Can we remove the password? And he had given us all that information the night before. And Eric and Anthony went off to try and get a message out with the InReach. They were having lots of issues and we were unable to get help from David. So I went up to elevation, brought my amateur radio, and entered in manually all of the repeaters that I was seeing. There were two that were 10 miles from my location. I was able to get into one. I was barely able to break the squelch on the repeater, and essentially I said, break, break, this is KT1 RUN with a medical emergency. Does anybody copy? Repeated multiple times for about 15 minutes. Nobody came back to me. I tried the nationwide simplex frequency on figures 146.520 with the same transmission. Nothing. So at that point, I came back down the bouldering I had done and met up with the guys, and they said, yeah, we were able to get a transmission out with a Garmin InReach. And I'm not fully up to speed on everything that happened, so let me go ahead and get my phone and I'll go ahead and walk you through some of the text because this guy saved a life and saved the day. In fact, this is my Garmin InReach Mini 2 after this experience. And I know they're expensive, but given the amount of backpacking we do, this is absolutely now critical gear for my kit and something that's going to augment my amateur radios. So let me go ahead and read off some of the interaction between search and rescue while using the InReach. All right, so one thing to note about the Garmin InReach based on this experience of using the SOS feature, it took about 3 minutes for each transmission and about 3 minutes for response. So a full round trip based on how we experienced this was about 6 minutes. So keep that in mind. So I'm going to go through a few of the messages that came through on the phone through the InReach, just so you get a sense of the interaction. There was some earlier interactions between the Garmin dispatcher to 911. asking what type of situation it was. We indicated medical, diabetic emergency. There was some more back and forth, and then they finally connected us with INEO Search and Rescue, the SAR group. And this first one here is, this is INEO County SAR. Please advise situation of medical emergency and subject's height, weight, clothing, and date of birth. So we responded with all of that information. And since my cousin was a former EMT and current nurse, he suspected that it was hyperglycemia, which in fact was the case. The next thing, they wanted to know our location. They did have our GPS location, but they wanted to confirm it nonetheless. So we basically said we're at trail camp and that the GPS coordinates should be correct as well. We followed up with more information. This was the date of birth. They acknowledged that, and they asked if we could move to trail camp. So there was something missed here in the communication, and we indicated, yes, we are at trail camp, and that we were, in fact, able to move David if needed, via us kind of carrying him if needed. Okay, so at this point then, they indicated that they were going to dispatch a helo to our location, a military helicopter. In fact, it was a VX-31. They're attached to the Navy, and they go by the pseudonym of Dust Devils. So thank you so much, guys. You were absolutely amazing. So anyways, this went on for a bit. We knew we had some time until they arrived. So the plan was to keep my cousin Anthony with David to make sure that his vitals were taken care of and that he's warm and comfortable in the tent. So I said, guys, let's go ahead and make sure we're ready to move if needed. So since we had gone through all of our water because we were out for about 17 hours getting off the mountain, Eric and I went and we filled up water. We decided not to screw around this time with pumps. We just filled all of the smart water bottles and just hit it with the chlorine tabs and came back. So I'll talk about the little kit that I actually made for myself at the end. But basically, I decided that I needed some bare essentials to be able to quickly move multiple miles if needed, but still have some essential gear without being burdened by the pack. So we get back to the site. We start to collect all of our belongings, make sure that we're ready to leave and get off the peak as quickly as David is taken care of. So we still had a little bit of time, and I had the feeling that I did not want to take charge, but I had some recommendations, and I wanted to make sure that since we were supporting David and the three of us were still in good condition and fully hopped up on adrenaline, but keeping it cool, mind you, that we did not need support ourselves. So everybody put on sunscreen, everybody put the clothes that were appropriate for that temperature. They put the clothing they might need for later in the day at the top of their packs. Everybody hydrated, everybody took a piss or a dump, whatever they needed, just so we wouldn't have to worry about that stuff in the event that we needed to, move quickly. So everything at this point was taken care of, and then we see the helo come in. It does a number of passes, and these guys ended up finding an LZ that was about 200 meters from our location. So they came down with a collapsible litter. They assessed David in the situation. I had basically taken out my emergency blanket. We wrapped them up just in case there was a need to deal with shock, so we deployed that as a prophylactic. They came over, asked a few questions, and then we started to help load him onto the litter. And then we all helped take turns holding and carrying the litter up to the LZ. And we loaded him up, and we basically backed off, and the pilot was like, move back, and we were just doing thumbs up. And that clip you saw at the beginning where my face is being sucked back, it's because we did not move back far enough. So there was dirt and debris flying everywhere. They took off, and VX-31, the Dust Devils, actually took them to a nearby hospital. So at that point, we decided to pack up. We were pretty much packed up, but we had to do the 6 miles back down to get to Portal Campground. I strapped on David's pack onto my pack. Ultimately, the total weight was about 52 to 54 pounds. and then we took turns alternating that pack every mile because it was quite a bit heavy, and then we got basically off the peak. So guys, David is fine. Few lessons learned here. Number one, I don't think if we were to do this again, I don't think we would do another trip if there's a person in your party that has a known medical condition, in this case like type 1 diabetes, and their equipment is not working. We should have gone back to town, bought a glucometer, and then started our trip. So that was the first big lesson. The second lesson was communication can fail. I actually thought that given line of sight into Whitney Portal, being on the highest peak in the contiguous United States, that this radio would do the trick. It did get into the repeater, but nobody was there to listen. So my lesson learned was, all right, have a fail-safe, even if there's a monthly expense and a one-time investment. The Garmin InReach absolutely saved the day, in addition to the team coming together and being cool-headed, along with the support from the VX-31 search and rescue group. So Garmin InReach Mini now is part of my kit when I go out. Given the fact that we had to move around so much and be cognizant of gear as we were moving between water sources, camp, I was going off to do radio communication. This was the kit that I built for myself from all the gear I had. And it basically was a 1 liter smart bottle. And I borrowed David's holster. So there was a holster he had for the belt. So this ran alongside me. And then I put this on the other side of the belt. Now, say what you will about this kit, but I found it very useful. First, I have the Source Tactical Universal fill adapter. This screws onto the top here, and it allows me to quickly backfill my bladder. I find it a lot easier to stay hydrated if I have access to a bladder. It allows me to drink while I'm moving. I also had the emergency blanket. Again, we use this for David as a prophylactic, just to keep him warm, just in case their shock set in. And this also would have been good if we had to bivvy or stay unplanned overnight on the peak as a mechanism to deal with the cold temperatures. I also wanted to have a high calorie bar. This one is like 320 calories, so just a little bit to give me additional calories. One of the big things that I found was the importance of having a good headlamp. This was a black diamond headlamp, and we use this to get off the mountain. This one takes 4 AAA batteries, and I also make sure that I had always a set of extra batteries. In fact, I had to go through and tap into that. Oh yeah, so here's the extra battery pack, or sets of batteries. Now this kit also contains all of the other essential items. So I wanted to make sure that, for example, I did not get consumed by the elements. So Dermatone is basically a nice way to have sunscreen protection for your nose, ears, neck, and face. We carried Advil or ibuprofen for any pains that might set in. So we were taking ibuprofen every 4 hours, I believe, during this exercise, just because we did not want to have our bodies experience a whole bunch of pain, so that we could properly support David. The other medicines that I am personally bringing with me are in one of these small mint tins, and they include, obviously now I have 3 pills of Zofran, so next time there is an issue where there's vomiting and nausea, I have these. These were basically sourced out of my contingency medical prescription. So thanks a lot, guys. I'm glad to have this in my kit now. And then I also had quite a bit of Tylenol. So we would use Tylenol for the headaches when they would set in. And the cool thing about Advil or ibuprofen and Tylenol is that they target different sections of your body. So while you don't want to use them together for too long, we actually did use them to target headaches and body pains concurrently, and then spaced out the dosage. And then Benadryl I always keep, mostly because I have a reaction to bites. But I also learned on this trip from Anthony, who was our EMT and nurse, that Benadryl is a wonderful sleep aid. So that night where we got back and had to make a decision the following morning what to do with David, everybody took Benadryl to knock them out overnight. And then I'm not gonna screw around with water anymore and just do right by my uncle. So the iodine tablets absolutely are part of my core kit. Glad I had them in my larger kit. And while they turn this water brown, the taste is not so bad, especially if you throw in some electrolyte powder like Propel. And then obviously a whistle, a couple of Band-Aids just in case, and then like an antiseptic wipe. So not a whole lot in the way of gear, but this is what I was running around when we were trying to get help, just in case I needed some support. But with that said, I really hope you guys enjoyed this video and letting me tell you this story. Bear in mind that we're all fairly active individuals, all fairly strong, all fairly competent backcountry adventurers, and we had to call for help. So keep that in mind. And while some of this stuff sounds like it is an extreme investment in money, these all turned out to be life-saving gear that ultimately, I believe, saved our cousin David's life. So big thank goes out to my cousins Eric and Anthony for being tremendous team players and providing support. Big thanks to the VX-31, the Dust Devils, the search and rescue group, and then also to a gentleman by the name of Ahmed, who was the nurse anesthetist who helped us out with the Zofran and helped assess David's vitals. So since I said I'm going to call this still a no random contact video, we use this technology to make a targeted contact to search and rescue. So guys, we're going to call this a success in terms of no random contacts. This is about the most successful you could be in terms of making a targeted contact, because when it came to it, we got the help we needed. So I don't know if I have anything to drink to toast here, but this goes out to my Tio Mario. He led an incredible life, and we're happy to have summited and honored him by doing this peak. I'm the Tech Prepper. Be strong, be safe, and be prepared. I have not been on this trail in 30 years, and apparently you have to poop in a bag, so last chance. We'll see how that goes.